story recapped here. Today I'm gonna explain a drama, sci-fi, and thriller film called The Final Cut. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. When he was still a child, Alan made a new friend named Lewis. While they start hanging out, Alan comes across an abandoned factory which immediately intrigues him. On the other hand, Lewis is more cautious and keeps telling Alan that they should leave. Just then, Alan bravely crosses a wooden plank to get to the other side of the factory. Albeit afraid, Lewis follows suit. However, he doesn't safely make it across and ends up falling from a great height. The last thing Alan remembers is seeing Lewis' body amidst a pool of blood before running away in fear. Driving away from the place with his parents, Alan will never see Lewis again. In the present day, Alan now works as a memory cutter, one who takes the memories in one's Zoe implants so they can splice together a video of a person's life using their best memories. But cutters have to abide by 3 codes. 1. A cutter cannot sell or give away Zoe footage. 2. A cutter cannot have a Zoe implant. And 3. A cutter cannot mix Zoe footage from different lives for a re-memory. Currently, Alan is working on a re-memory for Daniel Monroe, the deceased brother of his client Jason. The scenes show Daniel's life, as recorded by his Zoe implant, and Jason is more than happy to see the fond memories of his brother. Before leaving, Jason compliments Alan's work and is excited to see the finished project during the re-memory. After Jason leaves, Alan continues to inspect memories from Daniel's life to add to the compilation. However, Alan comes across a clip of Daniel committing domestic abuse. Without a moment's hesitation, Alan deletes that specific clip. An advertisement for the Zoe implant is playing on the bus, and a young couple even expresses excitement to save up for one. There, Alan comes across a man with face tattoos. Later on, a conversation is ongoing between Alan's cutter colleagues, Hassan, Thelma, and her assistant Michael. When Alan arrives, Hassan immediately tells him about the current movement of the anti-Zoe advocates, people who deem the implant invasive because people's lives should be kept personal and not readily available for others to watch. Furthermore, Hassan introduces Alan to Michael with pride, calling Alan the best memory cutter in town. After the pleasantries, Alan asks why he was called to meet them. Then Thelma proceeds to tell him about a job to cut Charles Bannister's life, a lawyer who works for iTech, the company behind the Zoe implants. After Charles died, his wife Jennifer started looking for a cutter, and Thelma is offering it to Alan. Meanwhile, Michael says that Thelma could just take the job because her schedule is wide open. However, Thelma declines, saying she can't handle the ugly stuff because Charles is human garbage. On the other hand, Alan is already used to such stuff and isn't affected by the dark secrets in people's lives. Later that night, Alan goes to see Delilah, a librarian with whom he's infatuated. Despite brushing Alan off at first, Delilah tells Alan to wait for her shift to be over. Then, he brings her to his workplace. When Delilah's eyes fall upon the guillotine, the machine used to cut memories, she compares Alan's job to being a mortician because he gets to see life upon life. With a curious mind, Delilah asks further about Alan's job. So Alan inquires if Delilah has been to a re-memory before. Turns out, she's only been to one, her ex-boyfriend's, where she didn't even stay, stating that she wanted to remember him in her own way. Afterward, Alan makes her watch the memories of a man called Davis. The scenes just show Davis' life going backward, always in the same scene of him in the bathroom. Alan explains that it's a miniature cut of Davis' life, done symmetrically, the way Alan sees life. That night, the two sleep together. The next day, Alan goes to work and meets Jennifer to ask about Charles. Meanwhile, their daughter Isabel eavesdrops on their conversation. In his interview, Alan asks Jennifer about her memories with Charles and which ones they would like to keep for the re-memory. All the while, every statement that comes from Jennifer is positive. But when Alan pries further, Jennifer tells Alan that Charles deserves to be remembered as a great man. Furthermore, she seems apprehensive about letting Alan talk to Isabel. Still, Alan reminds her that whatever they're hiding about Charles, he'll soon see in his memory storage anyway. After concluding their business, Jennifer thanks Alan, implying that she doesn't want him to be careless with Charles' memories. The time comes for Daniel's re-memory, a funeral service held where they can watch the lifetime memories of the deceased person. However, a lot of anti-Zoe protesters were making a ruckus outside the service, shouting at people to remember memories for themselves. This scene makes Carolyn, Daniel's wife, cry because of their disrespect to the dead. During the ceremony, everyone fondly watches Daniel's entire life, seeing only the good parts of him as a person. While this is going on, Alan makes sure to take notes at the side. While everyone else is busy watching, Alan encounters Fletcher, an ex-cutter, who tells him that Alan is making lies out of people's lives. Fletcher asks Alan how he can stomach seeing the bad in people and only showing the good to others. Moreover, However, Fletcher didn't approach him for formalities. Instead, he wants to ask for Charles' memory storage and offers Alan money for it. However, that goes against the Cutter's code, so Alan refuses. After the ceremony, Jason confronts Alan about Daniel's memory, asking if he changed a certain aspect because he remembers something differently. But Alan assures him that he doesn't change anything. When Fletcher bids goodbye to Alan, Fletcher tells him that he won't give up the Bannister file. Furthermore, he still looks down on Cutters. Later on, as Alan leaves the funeral service, he catches sight of Carolyn crying while being comforted by Natalie, someone he saw in Daniel's memories as his mistress. While Alan is leaving Daniel's rememory, everyone is unaccepting of Alan's profession. One of the protesters doesn't hesitate to hit Alan on the back with their sign. Afterward, he goes to get Charles' Zoe implant in iTech storage so he can start cutting his memories. Right away, Alan inputs Charles' implant in the guillotine, where the moments in his life are immediately grouped into similar categories, all amounting to 544,628 hours lived by Charles. While working on the memories, Alan also accompanies this with research on the person to make sure she gets the best memories grouped. However, in one particular memory, Alan finds a scene where it's implied that Charles was assaulting his daughter Isabel. In the memory, Charles takes Isabel down to his study and locks themselves inside. Afterward, Alan immediately cuts the footage with zero remorse and splices it to make Charles look like a good father. While Alan continues working on the video, he finds another memory where he sees a familiar man. Right away, he remembers Lewis from his childhood and assumes it to be him. Immediately, he makes it a point to search for Lewis in the rest of Charles' memories. Afterward, he goes to Delilah and tells her about Lewis. However, Delilah is a bit upset that Alan hasn't called her since the night they spent together. Still, Alan says that he needs her, but Delilah keeps pointing out that Alan is too engrossed in his work to make time for a relationship, much less for himself, so Alan just walks away. After weaving through Charles' memories, he finds it difficult to find any other signs of Lewis, so Alan goes to Thelma for assistance. There, he sees that Michael has a bruised face, which he doesn't care to explain. When Alan asks to talk to Thelma privately, he tells her about Fletcher. They both suspect Fletcher of being part of the anti-implant groups. Furthermore, they point out how aggressive the protesters have started to become, and they were even the people who gave Michael the bruises. Then, Thelma tells Alan that Charles' file isn't worth fighting for, so he should just give it to Fletcher. However, Alan doesn't want to give it up now, especially after probably seeing Lewis in it. So alternatively, Thelma tells him to interview the Bannisters subtly about it. Afterward, Alan meets up with Oliver, a criminal, to acquire a gun. However, Oliver is immediately hostile toward Alan. However, Alan doesn't falter, and instead, he starts threatening Oliver by revealing the secrets that Alan has seen in someone else's memories. So Oliver gives him a gun. Eventually, Alan re-encounters Fletcher, who's still insistent about taking Charles' implant. Furthermore, he explains that he wanted Charles' implant so they could expose Charles' misdeeds and take down iTech. However, Alan still wouldn't give in, so Fletcher just looks down on Alan for making bad people look like saints. Because of this, Alan compares himself to a sin eater. A few seconds later, Fletcher threatens Alan with his associate, but Alan just walks away unbothered. Back at the guillotine, Alan still can't find other traces of Lewis, so he excitedly goes back to the Bannisters to interview Jennifer about more moments. However, when he asks about Lewis, Jennifer waves this off as irrelevant, so Alan goes to ask Isabel instead. When he gets to Isabel's room, Alan relaxes her nerves by keeping her bedroom door open while they converse. When he asks about Charles, Isabel is immediately defensive and seems to say a rehearsed line about how her father was so great. But eventually, Alan was able to win Isabel over, who doesn't seem to be fond of talking about Charles, so he asks about Lewis instead. Immediately, Isabel knows who he's talking about. Turns out, Lewis used to be her teacher before dying a year ago. Later that night, Hassan drives Alan to iTech so he can sneak in and steal Lewis' Zoe implant if he has any. Inside, Kareem, Hassan's cousin, helps them look for Lewis files. However, instead of Lewis files, Alan finds his own, despite thinking he never had an implant. The news comes as a shock to him, so he immediately watches the video where Alan's parents bought a Zoe implant for him as a child. Angered, Alan punches a mirror in frustration. Furthermore, he continues having a mental breakdown even after stepping outside. Immediately, he calls Delilah to come over, and right away, she tends to him. Because he appreciates her help, Alan shows Delilah a few clips from defective Zoe implants, where the memories can't differentiate reality from the person's imaginations. When Delilah falls asleep, Alan sneaks off to an anti-implant group. unable to notice Fletcher and his associate parked outside his apartment to watch his moves. Finally, Alan gets to the anti-implant place, where the tattoo artists have discovered a way to malfunction the Zoe implant by using electrosynthetic ink. First, they do the audio tattoo to make the implant stop recording sound. Then, the tattoo artist advises Alan to return after a week, so the tattoo artist makes a discreet tattoo for him. Afterward, Alan goes back to his apartment and hears someone using the guillotine inside. Assuming Fletcher broke in, Alan loads his gun before going inside and seeing the ransacked apartment, but it turns out it was simply Delilah, who caught Alan having the files of her ex-boyfriend's memories. So Alan puts down the gun as Delilah becomes angry at him for looking at the memories that should have only been theirs. When Alan tries to reach for Delilah apologetically, she slaps him away and takes his gun. Without hesitation, she shoots his guillotine, damaging his files alongside Charles's. When he brings Charles's broken implant to Hassan, he says he can't fix it anymore. So Alan suggests accessing someone else's implant for the memories. But when Alan admits to his own implant, Hassan immediately punches him. Waking up from unconsciousness, Alan sees Thelma is now in the room, also angry that Alan has an implant because it breaks the cutter's code. However, Alan defends himself by saying that he never knew from the start because his parents died before being able to tell him. After a ton of convincing, Hassan agrees to access Alan's memories, but not before warning him that it's life-threatening because he's still alive. So they only have 5 minutes to look through it, but they also make him promise that he has to quit being a cutter. So, as Alan looks through his memories, he finds the moment with Lewis where he finds out that he's been remembering it all wrong. Turns out, Alan wasn't fully at fault because he tried stopping Lewis from crossing the plank, but it was Lewis who kept going. Furthermore, when Lewis fell, he didn't die from the height, and the blood he remembered turned out to be just red paint that he knocked over. With just a few seconds left in the 5 minutes, Alan manages to come out of the process alive and finally free from the guilt. When Alan returns home, he sees Fletcher and his associate ransacking his apartment for Charles' implant. However, Alan shows them the damaged implant. Because of this, Fletcher leaves after no longer being able to get what he came for. The next day, Alan comes over to the Bannisters and apologizes for Charles' lost memories, blaming it on a faulty guillotine. After straightening the issue, Alan leaves. Once they're left alone, Isabel is noticeably wary of Jennifer and runs away from her. Later on, Alan visits Lewis' grave, only to encounter Fletcher once more, but this time, he comes with a purpose. Turns out, he found out about Alan's tattoo and realizes that he has a Zoe implant. Because of this, he's still adamant about getting Charles' memories through Alan's eyes. Knowing that Fletcher would have to kill him to take his implant, Alan runs while Fletcher follows behind, shooting his gun at him. But after a while, Alan trips, making Fletcher catch up to him. However, Fletcher couldn't bring it in himself to shoot Alan, seemingly letting him go. But Alan still doesn't make it out alive because Fletcher's associate kills Alan for him. Right away, Fletcher scours through Alan's memories, saying that Alan's death will be for the greater good, and promises to make his life mean something.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.